From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump on Thursday finished his 10th day in a Manhattan courtroom in his hush money trial, where he stands accused of falsifying business records regarding payments made to a former adult film star. How's the trial going? What's the latest? And what is it actually like in that courtroom? Welcome to Potomac Watch. I am Kim Strassel, and today we've got a special treat for you because we can answer that question. My colleague Kyle Peterson spent yesterday in person in that space watching this drama unfold, and he's going to give us a firsthand account.
Hi, Kim. How you doing?
Good. So my first question, just because it's one that's been plaguing me ever since this trial began, is it really as cold as Donald Trump claims it is in the courtroom? Did you need a jacket? Did your fingers go numb? How cold is it in there?
It didn't seem cold to me. Maybe I run a little hot. I was more hankering for the cup of coffee that I was denied. No eating or drinking in the courtroom, no cell phone usage, which these days sometimes is almost worse than no coffee. But it is a fascinating space. So the Manhattan Criminal Courthouse is a big Art Deco building in downtown Manhattan. The press starts lining up there around 7 o'clock. The building looks like kind of the bottom of the Chrysler building, but inside the vibe is more aging high school. Fluorescent lights. The courtroom is on the 15th floor, high ceilings and wood paneling, but the floor is a tan tile like something out of an old school cafeteria. You have the judge up there on the bench, the defense and the prosecution at tables in front, the jury in 2 rows of seats on the right wall, heads going back and forth between the witness and the prosecution and the defense, kind of like they're at a tennis match. And then behind that are the wood benches, maybe 60, 70 press. There are a few sketch artists there that are working away with their pastels. And laptops are okay, so there's a lot of clicking and clacking depending on what's happening, but no phones, no recording. At about 9:15, without announcement, Trump and his entourage came in, and then the prosecution team with their cardboard boxes of briefs, a little bit like Law and Order. They bring the witness in, all rise for the jury, and away they go.
So that's the physical scene. It doesn't sound like a big space.
No, I mean, I would count like maybe 60, 65 press and then a few dozen attorneys and court police and stuff that are there. But no, it is a remarkably small space for what's going on in there.
So very, very cozy. That's the physical space. But lay the scene for us, too, when you're in there. What is the mood or the vibe? Is it like a made-for-TV courtroom drama every minute, riveting? Is it boring? Does the jury look engaged? Does the judge look engaged? Does Donald Trump look engaged? I mean, how hard was it without your phone to stay awake, or could you not take your eyes off it?
It yo-yos back and forth. I would say it is a strange sort of mix of riveting and deadly, deadly boring. So there were 2 witnesses yesterday. One of them was Keith Davidson, the attorney for Stormy Daniels, and Karen McDougal, another woman who reportedly received hush money for an alleged affair with Donald Trump. And 1 minute you have the prosecution or the defense that is interrogating Keith Davidson, and he's saying things like Michael Cohen, Trump's former fixer, was despondent that he was not going to Washington with the newly elected president. He had thought that he might be the chief of staff. He had thought that he might even be the U.S. Attorney General. And I thought he was going to kill himself. So you have some very emotional, charged testimony. And 30 minutes before that or 30 minutes after that, they might be asking the witness to please look at this contract and can you read to us this paragraph about liquidated damages and tell the jury what it means. They also have evidence witnesses. My understanding is that in some trials, the prosecution and the defense, they agree to stipulate that some of the records, the evidence being introduced and shown to the jury is real and factual, and that at least for some of this, the Trump team has not agreed to that stipulation. So the second witness yesterday was somebody from the investigation, a technical expert who was brought in. He is on the team that received 2 iPhones from from Michael Cohen, and he was being asked questions about how he went through the process of taking those phones and what they do with them, how they extract them. Questions like, what kind of messaging apps are on these phones? Can you explain to us what WhatsApp is? And so it is a bit of a mix. Sometimes it is hard to take your eye off of, and you can hear a pin drop. And sometimes you can still hear a pin drop because there are court police there that are enforcing no whispering, no talking, no phones. But it is pretty dry. I saw quite a few people yawning.
Yeah, it's funny for those of us who have actually sat on juries, and I would wager many people who are listening have. I think that's always one of the big surprises when you end up serving on a jury in a trial or watching a trial, is how much of it is actually required legally to actually establish, for instance, witnesses and procedures to go through the way that the evidence was secured and handled. There's a lot of background material that goes into all of this, which isn't really the meat of the question. Kyle, before I ask you some specific questions about that Davidson testimony, can you just remind listeners, because I think it's important, what do prosecutors need to prove here in this case? What's the end goal as they bring these witnesses up?
So they need to prove that Donald Trump falsified business records regarding the repayment to Michael Cohen for his payment to Stormy Daniels, and that Donald Trump did so with intent to commit or to cover up a second crime. And a couple of theories that the prosecution has raised. The first is that second crime is that Michael Cohen's payoff was in effect a campaign donation to Donald Trump's presidential campaign, which should have been reported, was not reported, and was over the federal limits for donations. Or two, that the Trump administration booked that repayment to Michael Cohen as income, and that amounts to tax fraud, more or less.
So to go to that Davidson testimony, and again, he was the lawyer who represented both Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal in their negotiations with both the National Enquirer and the Trump lawyer Michael Cohen. And there was a couple of moments that I understand the jury got to read the actual agreement, for instance, that Davidson negotiated on Stormy Daniels' behalf. They also got to hear some audio of conversations that Cohen had recorded with different players, including one with Donald Trump in 2016, supposedly about the plan to buy Karen McDougal's story. We've got that clip. Let's take a listen.
We need to open up a company for the transfer of all of that info regarding our friend David, so that I'm going to do that right away. I've actually come up and I've spoken to Alan Weisselberg about how to set the whole thing up with funding. Yes. And it's all the stuff, because, you never know where that company, you never know where he's going to be. Correct. So I'm all over that. And I spoke to Alan about it when it comes time for the financing, which will be...
What financing?
We'll have to pay you. So no. I got... No.
So, Kyle, this was actually played by the prosecutors. Tell us what's going on in this clip and why the prosecutors are playing it. What are they hoping to show?
I think they're doing a couple things. The first is that they're trying to show that Donald Trump was aware of the kinds of payoffs that were happening. In this clip, Michael Cohen is referring to the alleged payoff of Karen McDougal, not the alleged payoff of Stormy Daniels, which is what is actually at issue in the charges that Trump is facing. But they're trying to establish that Cohen, as Trump's lawyer, was keeping him in the loop on these sorts of things. And if Trump was advised about what was happening with the Karen McDougal situation, you can imagine he was also advised about what was happening with Stormy Daniels. And so they're trying to get to his knowledge and they're trying to get to his intent. The other thing I think the prosecution is trying to do is build up their case in a steady sort of manner. My understanding is that was the first time that Michael Cohen's voice had been heard in court was on Thursday. There were a few of these clips of recordings that Michael Cohen had made, one with Donald Trump, the soon-to-be president, and another with Keith Davidson, again, this lawyer for Stormy Daniels. And so it seems like they're trying to introduce Michael Cohen a little bit. It's still expected that the prosecution will call Michael Cohen as the star witness. That hasn't happened yet, but they're trying to explain to the jury a little bit about who he is and his closeness with President Trump.
This is fascinating. Okay, we're going to take a really quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit, too, about Donald Trump and his defense team and how they're handling handling some of this evidence in the trial room when we come back. Welcome back to Potomac Watch. I am Kim Strassel. I am here with my colleague Kyle Peterson, who spent his Thursday in that Manhattan courtroom with Donald Trump. Kyle, you were just telling us a little bit about what the prosecution is attempting to do, including with some of these audio clips that were introduced into the trial room yesterday. Donald Trump has not been happy with the judge's decisions to allow certain evidence, also obviously with what he views as a gag order that's put on him. He has been using his time when he comes out of the courtroom or when he shows up or when he leaves to brief the press on his feelings on all of this. Let's listen to him talk about how he views some of the decisions the judge has made.
The judge is highly conflicted. He should not be allowed to be the judge of this case. He's trying to make it as salacious as possible by allowing testimony that has nothing to do with the case. He wants to make it a nice salacious case, try and hurt Trump, but it's having the opposite effect, I think. We'll see, but the poll numbers are higher than they've ever been, and that's the story. But he's trying to make it as salacious. He's allowing things in that have nothing to do with this case, nothing to do with it. And he's allowing things in, but nothing for us. He gives everything to the corrupt DA. We have a corrupt DA who's not doing his job.
So, Kyle, first of all, what do you make of that allegation? Is the judge letting things into this case that are purely salacious? This has been a common complaint of Donald Trump, that there's a sort of general goal here to talk about a lot of aspects of his life that are not necessarily directly related to these bookkeeping entries that had to do with the Stormy Daniels money. So is it salacious? But then I think the other question I'd like you to answer is it necessarily all bad for Trump, though? Because by reports, Donald Trump's defense team was making hay with some of these audio clips and other evidence themselves, trying to use it to build a very different case in Donald Trump's favor that would help him in the long run.
There was definitely some salacious material that was brought up on Thursday when I was there. But Kim, you're exactly right that most of it, I think, was coming from the defense team, Donald Trump's lawyer, Emil Bovee, who was doing a pretty good cross-examination, I think, of Davidson, the Stormy Daniels lawyer. And he was asking about other high-profile settlements that Davidson had helped clients negotiate, or in the defense's words, extract money from actors and so forth. So Charlie Sheen was brought up, Lindsay Lohan was brought up, Hulk Hogan was brought up. And the defense's argument was that Davidson was familiar with extortion law and was trying to tiptoe up to the very line of what he could do to get famous people to give big sums of money for claims that his clients were bringing up against them. And so there was definitely some salacious material, but I thought that was sort of helpful, maybe persuasive to some members of the jury, that this was not a claim that was brought to Donald Trump's attention shortly before the 2016 election, trying to settle some sort of legal dispute, that this was an attempt to get some money out and use the date of the coming 2016 election as leverage against Donald Trump, since Davidson and Stormy Daniels knew that that was their date certain for when they could probably get the most money out of him.
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong here, too. And the reason that this matters, as I listen to you talk about this, is because I don't think that anyone can much argue, nobody's really disputing very much, that payments were made. Obviously, one question is Donald Trump's knowledge of them. Okay, we can try to do that. But the payments were made, all right? And Alvin Bragg could make a case in court that it was wrong and fraudulent to categorize them as legal expenses. That is one aspect of this, because the money obviously ended up going through Michael Cohen and then he was repaid, etc. But those are like misdemeanors, kind of foot faults. And the issue here, as you said in the beginning, is that the prosecutors need to show that this was an aide or in the intent of furthering a secondary crime. And a lot of things have been thrown out there as possibilities for what that might be from the prosecution. But a lot of them hinge on the notion that this was somehow a campaign expense and therefore was improperly managed and handled. And I'm guessing here that the goal of the defense team and Donald Trump is, if they can suggest that these payments were being done because Donald Trump was being extorted, as it were, that there is any other reason that they were being put forward that potentially helps in their defense.
I think that's right. I think the other reason to go down that route is just to impeach the credibility of the witness that they have sitting in the witness box in the eyes of the jury. And Keith Davidson, I think, looked a little bit evasive at times. He looked perhaps like he might have been embarrassed to be talking about some of these settlements that he allegedly helped his clients do in a public forum. And so I think that's part of it too, is the defense is trying to inject any sort of doubt into every aspect of this as they possibly can in ways that might be persuasive to the jury or might not be, but we don't know at this point. I mentioned the second witness yesterday was this technical expert who was talking about the process that investigators use. They have these phones from Michael Cohen and they're trying to get the data off them. And the defense lawyer got up there and did his cross-examination and was saying things like, but hang on, the FBI had these phones before you, right? And you don't know exactly what they did to them. And there are ways that data can be corrupted and so forth. And personally, I'm skeptical that the jury is going to think that the FBI was tampering with Michael Cohen's phones. And so we can't trust these recordings that are on it. But they're trying to use every avenue they possibly can to get at the duty of the jury to convict only if they find that the prosecution has proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt, which again is a very high standard.
Well, you just used the magic words, Kyle. Reasonable doubt. Okay, we're going to take one more break. When we come back, a little bit more about what's been going on in the courtroom and what's to come when we come back.
Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back to Potomac Watch. Again, I am Kim Strassel. I'm here with Kyle Peterson, getting his recollections and descriptions of what happened in that Manhattan courtroom yesterday with Donald Trump. One other thing did happen yesterday, Kyle, and it's because it's been in the news this week. Donald Trump began the week with a fine from the judge for having violated the gag order the judge had imposed on him. It was fined $9,000, although he did escape the possibility at that moment of jail time. Prosecutors came back in again yesterday, and the trial began with yet another hearing. They were alleging that there were 4 more instances of Donald Trump violating the gag order. Where is all that headed? What was the judge's reaction to that? And is this going to continue to be an explosive aspect of this jury trial?
I think it is. My guess is that the judge is not going to do much more at this point. I think some of these statements by President Trump were handed up as complaints by the prosecution before he had made his ruling, I think earlier this week, fining Donald Trump $9,000 for 9 violations of the gag order. And so I think that the judge may have the opinion now that President Trump is on notice, and maybe a couple of these are worth $1,000 more each, which is the maximum punishment for criminal contempt of court in the state of New York, as he wrote in his earlier ruling. Notable also that the prosecution on Thursday said that they are not yet seeking jail for these examples of what they say is contempt of court, because they're trying to minimize disruptions of the trial. And so my guess is that it will not really go anywhere at this point unless President Trump decides to escalate. And it is notable that part of the earlier ruling by the judge was that President Trump was going to be ordered to take down those statements about witnesses and about the jury. And as far as I understand, he has done that on his campaign page and his Truth Social page. So he seems to be complying with that aspect of it so far.
Speaking of the prosecutors, here's a question. There was a lot of talk going into this case that there were a lot of holes in Alvin Bragg's theory and the charges that he brought. And those were complaints that were even being made by liberal law scholars, saying that they felt that of all the cases that were out there, this one was really the most tenuous legally. But how would you rate both the prosecutorial team and the defense team in terms of how they're handling themselves in a courtroom? As we all know, charges are one thing, and then the performance, as it were, the capability of the lawyers in question often will play a good role. You can have a very strong case and a lawyer who just does a terrible job arguing it. So how do you rate or rank Alvin Bragg's team that's in that building, but also Donald Trump's defense lawyers that are working on his behalf.
Well, I think Emil Bovee did a pretty nice job with his cross-examination yesterday. It seems like he knows how to go about this trial work in a way that is helpful to the defense. The thing about the prosecution is, it seems to me, what we were discussing earlier, the facts of the case turn on whether President Trump had knowledge of these kinds of deals and had intent that they were setting about to commit a second crime. And so to the extent that they have these recordings made by Michael Cohen, which also makes you wonder who else was Michael Cohen recording and how many more of these tapes does he have that are going to be pulled out during this trial? I don't know the answer to that. That makes their job, I think, somewhat easier on those facts. It may actually not be that difficult to prove to the jury that Donald Trump knew this kind of hush money payment was going out and that he approved of it. The problem with this case, and the legal analysts that you're citing, I think, were pointing to this, is that when you get up on appeal, then you're going to have an argument about whether did this payment by Michael Cohen, was that actually a campaign donation under federal law? And that's where I think this case could potentially have problems after a conviction. And that is not really in Alvin Bragg's courtroom right now. That's not the challenge he has proving to the jury at the moment, I think.
So how much longer do we have to go? How far along is prosecution in its case? People have talked about weeks longer. I've been hearing some people say it could be longer than that. Who's coming up next, and how much longer is all of this going to go on?
I think weeks is probably right. Part of that is that they are breaking on Wednesday. They're not having trial on Wednesdays because the judge has other obligations. The reporting out of the courthouse today is that Hope Hicks, former Trump aide, is testifying today on Friday. I don't know how long that will go. You can imagine that cross-examination by the defense is going to take a while on that. We certainly expect that Michael Cohen is going to testify. And again, I would expect that to take maybe a matter of days. I don't know if it will take more than a week just on that alone, but you can imagine the amount of information that the prosecution would try to get out. And you can imagine that the defense, if they see the case as turning on this key witness, would want to spend a lot of time drawing other information out and trying to impeach Michael Cohen's testimony. And so I think we still have weeks yet to go. Still no word yet on whether President Trump intends to testify in his own defense. But if he does that again, that will definitely take a while and be fascinating to watch.
How big a problem do prosecutors have with Michael Cohen as a witness? I mean, he obviously has been convicted with certain crimes himself. There has been a lot of complaints about his media tours talking about this. And there's just simply the fact, too, that as Donald Trump's personal lawyer, he was clearly engaged in a lot of work as a kind of fixer, who they're now putting up nonetheless as the guy to be trusted when it comes to these questions. And while you're at it and talking about witnesses, what do you think the odds are that Donald Trump does get up on that stand?
I think they have a big credibility problem with Michael Cohen, in particular because he has admitted to lying about so much stuff. Just recently, there was a federal judge who was pointing out that when he testified in a state civil trial against Donald Trump, Michael Cohen seemed to be acknowledging that he had lied to the federal judge when he was pleading guilty to a set of crimes, including making an excessive campaign donation in 2016. So what the prosecution will probably do, however, is use Michael Cohen's testimony to try to fill in some holes in the evidentiary record that they're trying to build, including with these recordings and other documents that they are getting directly from Michael Cohen, it seems. As for Donald Trump, I guess my guess would be that he would not testify simply because he would be opening himself up to so many questions under oath about all sorts of topics that he probably doesn't want to go there. And I'm not a lawyer, but you hear that defense attorneys often don't want their clients to testify. And sometimes it takes some persuading because there are many clients who really want to get on the stand and to say in a very loud voice in the court where they've been sitting in the cold as they perceive it for weeks that they didn't do anything wrong and this is all a sham. But sometimes that is not what is in the best legal interest in the case for the defense.
Yeah, I mean, I have to imagine, by the way, that Donald Trump fully falls into that category. I bet there's nothing he'd love more than to get up and tell the whole world on the stand exactly how he feels about all this. But I see your point, and I would wager that his defense team is strongly arguing with him against that situation. Thank you, Kyle. This was absolutely fascinating. Thank you also for your service of sitting in that courtroom all day. It couldn't have been a ton of fun. We thank our listeners for being here with us this week. We are here every weekday, and we will be back on Monday. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. And if you like the show, please hit the subscribe button. Thanks.